Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegates. Well, I have 3 reports to present today. First, I will start with my thematic report on missing migrants. The phenomenon of preventable death and disappearance of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers is a tragic and largely underestimated human rights challenge. In my report, I have identified several factors contributing to this phenomenon. These include the lack of adequate and accessible, safe, orderly, and regular migration pathways, due to increasingly restrictive migration policies and a high level of impunity. Lack of access to means of communication to call for assistance in emergencies, and obstacles to the identification and or return of remains of deceased migrants due to the lack of adequate search and forensic identification mechanisms and financial and logistical resources. Migrants may disappear as a result of immigration detention or deportation proceedings, including through agreement with third countries that do not comply with applicable procedural guarantees. Deportations, including deportation flights carried out under agreement with third countries, increase the risk of migrants being subjected to disappearance. Migrants further disappear, often for a limited period of time as a result of systematic practices of family separation at international borders and in detention and collective expulsion without individual protection assessment. I would like to remind all states that international law prohibits arbitrary or collective expulsion of non-nationals in all circumstances, and that states hold the obligation to conduct a reasonable and objective examination of each person's individual case. Such cases accumulate as a result of delays or omission in search and rescue operation for migrants in distress and due to smuggling and or trafficking, often by criminal groups, but in some of the cases with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state. Everyone has the right to be protected from enforced disappearance regardless of their migratory status. No circumstances, including those based on national security, lack of institutional capacity to process large number of migrants deprived of liberty expeditiously, or the enforcement of migratory regulations and policies may justify enforced disappearance, no matter the duration. In addition, considering some of the cases which I considered for the elaboration of my report, I would like to remind the states that the principle of non-refoulement extends to every person, regardless of their legal or migratory status. Distinguished delegates, to be perfectly clear, migrants are right holders, and their rights must be fully respected and protected, regardless of how they choose to cross international borders. All states need to recognize the inherent human dignity of migrants and states' human rights obligation under international human rights law. Widespread impunity perpetuates these cycles of disappearance. The families suffer anguish and despair because they lack information about the whereabouts or fate of their loved ones. Inadequate or deficient search and identification mechanisms prolong this state of uncertainty and effectively deny family members their right to know the circumstances of the disappearance and the progress or results of the investigation. This phenomenon also has a significant impact on the economic situation, mental health, and well-being of relatives of disappeared migrants. These effects are often exacerbated by situations of particular vulnerability of women and children in this context. For this reason, a swift, coordinated, and effective response by state is necessary to prevent and investigate such disappearances. The report's recommendations, therefore, include promoting the establishment of a truth and monitoring mechanism to ensure accountability, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition of migrant disappearances. Distinguished delegate, obstacles in existing national, regional, and international legal and policy frameworks and the lack of available statistical data on missing or forcibly disappeared migrants contributed to the continuous invisibility of the phenomenon. Given the inadequacy or lack of such data, states must step up efforts to establish a comprehensive reporting and data management system along remote migration routes and to remove overly bureaucratic and formalistic complaint procedures that make them inaccessible to family members of disappeared migrants. States must also make available an increased set of resources for rescue operation of migrants in distress at seas and on land. And humanitarian visas must be issued to family members of the disappeared migrant to enable them to participate effectively in search and investigation procedures. Against the background of these factors leading to migrant disappearance, in my report, I have examined best practices by states and international organizations. I welcome promising development in the establishment by states of national and regional mechanisms aimed at searching for disappeared migrants and preventing and investigating migrant disappearance in cooperation with civil society organizations, families, and victims. In preparing the report, I benefited from numerous contributions from states, United Nations entities, civil society actors, family members and victims, as well as other stakeholders. I take the opportunity to thank all those who replied to my call for input, and I would welcome further information on this issue and hope that the good practices identified in the report will be replicated by other states and organizations. I would like to highlight the need to expand these mechanisms by standardizing definitions and methodologies for cross-border data collection, improving comparability, establishing independent forensic investigation bodies, robust reporting mechanisms in migration center and transit point for collecting comprehensive and timely data, and effective safeguard for migrants and human rights defenders who face reprisals for their involvement in the search of their loved ones. I also call upon state parties to take measures to ensure enhanced interstate cooperation between countries of origin, transit, and destination to effectively protect migrants and prevent disappearance, including enforced disappearance, in a prompt and sustainable manner. Distinguished delegates, earlier this year, I conducted a visit focused on the human rights situation of migrants transiting the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous and complex migration routes in the world. While the Darien was a central concern, I also examined broader migration governance framework in place throughout both Colombia and Panama. Allow me here to thank the government of Colombia and Panama for their cooperation and support during my visit from 6 to 19 February this year. During my visit, I observed meaningful efforts by national authority to manage mixed migration movements, including through cooperation with international partners and the development of policy responses aimed at regularization and protection. I also commend the dedicated work of local authorities, civil society organizations, and UN agencies who often operate with limited resources and play a critical role in addressing urgent needs on the ground. However, I remain seriously concerned about the multiple and compounding risks faced by migrants, including gender-based violence, exposure to criminal networks, the risk of disappearance, and limited access to essential services as health care, information, and legal aid. I was further alarmed by the growing externalization and securitization of migration governance, especially through bilateral agreement that risks circumventing international human rights and refugee law obligations. In addition, the rise in reverse movement, where migrants are forced to move southward and become stranded in border zones without access to protection, coupled with a reduction in international cooperation funding, is deepening an alarming, urgent humanitarian situation and risk further violating the human rights of migrants. These realities highlight the need for a stronger coordination, sustainable support, and a more comprehensive rights-based approach at all levels of governance. In my report on Colombia and Panama, I set out a series of findings and recommendations aimed at strengthening regional cooperation, promoting human rights-based migration policies, and addressing the structural drivers of forced displacement of migrants. To conclude my presentation, I wish to inform that my upcoming report to the 80th session of the General Assembly will focus on the externalization of migration and the impact on the human rights of migrants. This report will be laying out the human rights concern of practices and policies, as well as the state responsibility emerging thereof. Thank you very much for your kind attention.